Take another break in our coverage here as we look at some of the pictures of the gathering crowd in Grant Park, Chicago, Illinois.
This crowd, as you said, Brian, they're expecting as many as 500,000 people to come out here.
Barack Obama seems on the verge of the presidency. Who could have imagined it?
On November 4th, 2008, at a little after 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, television networks began announcing the big news.
And CNN can now project that Barack Obama, 47 years old, will become the president-elect of the United States.
Almost immediately, discussion turned to the historical nature of the moment, and with good reason. For a country with such a dark history of slavery, disenfranchisement, and segregation, to elect a black man to the highest office in the land, well, it made for an emotional night.
This is a wonderful day for the world.
Fantastic.
History-making, first African-American president in the United States is beautiful. It's very, very beautiful.
I know what my grandparents and great-grandparents really witnessed and really went through. So it means a lot.
African-American men and women talked proudly about how far the country had come from just a few decades before, when merely registering to vote could be a matter of life and death.
A church where the pastor's own distant cousin was shot and killed for simply trying to vote in 1930.
It sends chills up my spine.
White Americans, too, talked about the country moving forward to a better and more tolerant place.
I think it demonstrates the best of America. I had a son born 8 weeks ago, and I think he's in a better world now.
Reverend Jackson, thank you very much.
Legendary civil rights leaders like the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who served as an aide to Martin Luther King Jr. and was with him the night he was shot, wept openly as he watched Obama's victory speech on election night.
Well, I must tell you, this is unreal, it's unbelievable.
And there was a similar sense of accomplishment from Congressman John Lewis, who put his life on the line during the Freedom Rides in the 1960s to help end segregation in the South, and to this day bears scars on his head from being mercilessly beaten by angry white mobs.
The struggle, the suffering, the pain, and everything that we tried to do to create a more perfect union, it was worth it. I just don't know how to express myself tonight. I'm overwhelmed.
It's been a long time coming. But tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
Feels like America did the right thing. It feels like there's a shift in consciousness. It feels like something really big and bold has happened.
We all grew up in school classrooms with some variation of this graphic. 43 people who have occupied the office. What do they all have in common, all the faces in these ovals? 43 of them are white males. That's the barrier that's been broken tonight.
It was an exciting night, and it was easy to get swept up in the moment. Clearly, the election meant something. But what exactly did it mean?
Does anyone know what this means in terms of change of race relations in the United States, or a perception of?
Well, I'll tell you one thing it means. As a former Secretary of Education, you don't take any excuses anymore from anybody who says the deck is stacked, I can't do anything, there's so much inbuilt this and that.
Did it mean that racism and hatred no longer posed a barrier to people of color?
And yes, it should have ended this discussion of there is a glass ceiling upon or beyond which African Americans cannot go. That's nonsense.
Did it mean that racism as we knew it had been dealt a death blow, and that a post-racial America had finally arrived?
We've achieved history tonight, and we've moved beyond something that has plagued this country from the very beginning. The whole idea of race and racial separation and unfairness.
Of course, no one would say that because Pakistan elected Benazir Bhutto as prime minister in 1988, that somehow that meant there was no more sexism in Pakistan. But that was exactly the kind of logic we got from a lot of people on election night here in America regarding race.
We have to admit that we're moving forward in this world, in this country, and that race issues, while not gone, are moving to the periphery.
These are the kind of issues that race scholar Imani Perry has been studying for years.
One of the things that happened with the election of President Obama is that he began to operate in the minds of some as an example that there were no longer barriers to racial discrimination in American society.
And those who tell us that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can.
The argument goes, well, this person was able to excel. This person was able to beat the odds, so why in the world can't you? But really, here's one person amongst 40 million, right, who has done this extraordinary thing. What we need to do to understand whether the society is racially just is to look at what's happening amongst the 40 million and why it is that we have a belief in racial equality and yet seem to have such difficulty in moving in the direction toward it.
We still have a problem with race. And I think that until we confront it, we address it, and we work on it, we won't be anywhere near post-racial. And it's really not post-racial that we're trying to become. We're trying to become post-racist.
Of course, if you bought into this post-racial thinking, you had to ignore quite a few glaring facts. First and foremost, the actual election results. While Barack Obama won the popular vote by a solid margin, few seemed to notice that he lost the white vote in a landslide, 57-43. Or that in southern states like Alabama and Mississippi, he received only 10% of the white vote. Now, does that mean that every white person who voted against him did so because he was black? Of course not. But there's no question that for some white folks, that was exactly the reason.
What does that mean, sir? Huh? What does that mean?
Get rid of him. I've had a number of people when he gets to the White House, strangers tell me this.
Even in northern states like Pennsylvania, it became clear that we were a long way from achieving the dream of a colorblind society.
Why are you supporting Senator McCain if you're a Democrat? Yeah, sure I do.
Let me read some of the things that we've heard at these rallies, or people have heard. They kill him. That was the first little bit of sound. Someone yelling, kill him, referring to Barack Obama in the background. Then treason has been yelled out, terrorist, and even someone's heard someone at the rally say, off with his head.
But none of this stopped the conservative pundits from blatantly ignoring this unpleasant reality.
The days of racism are over.
We have just achieved an incredible milestone.
And I take it, therefore, around the world, criticism of the United States for being a racist nation will now stop, right?
If they thought everything's fine when it comes to race in America, and that it's time to move on to other things.
We don't have racism in America anymore, so just knock it off with the charges of racism.
But in reality, the claim that we've gotten past racism and entered a post-racial society really is nothing new. In 1963, when pollsters from Gallup went door to door and asked white Americans if they thought whites and racial minorities were treated equally in matters of housing, education, and employment, 66% of whites said yes. In other surveys around the same time, Gallup found that nearly 90% of whites believed that black children had the same opportunities as white kids when it came to education.
6 kids were murdered in Birmingham on a Sunday and in Sunday school in a Christian nation, and nobody cared.
Now bear in mind, this was the height of segregation, a time when African Americans were forced to sit in the back of buses, where they were routinely refused service at restaurants and barred from voting in elections, a time when, if they dared to protest these things or step out of line, they were fire-hosed on the streets, beaten by police and white vigilantes, lynched and often jailed.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
In other words, around the same time that 200,000 people were gathering in Washington, D.C. to hear Dr. King rail against racism and injustice and demand a better future, most of us white folks were sitting at home wondering why the blacks were making such a fuss.
We're soliciting opinions on the Civil Rights Bill. Would you like to give us yours?
I'm sorry, but I don't think it's the time right now. I think they have equal rights, though. And I think this is the most ridiculous thing that has ever happened. The Negroes are just as free as we are. They have the same opportunity to work. I just don't understand it and don't approve of it. I'm going to stand up for my rights.
Americans have a long history of wanting to believe that everything's fine when it comes to race in America, and that it's time to move on to other things. And when we hear claims that we've finally entered a post-racial, colorblind society with the election of Barack Obama, we need to remember this history. Because the fact is, racial inequalities still exist, and racial bias still affects the way that we view others. The truth is, there are large and seemingly intractable gaps between whites and folks of color when it comes to income, wealth, and educational attainment, even basic health. Children born to African American women, for instance, are more than twice as likely to die within their first year than children born to white women. Even black women who don't smoke have higher rates of infant mortality for their children than white women who do smoke. You see the same trend with life expectancy. African American women will die 3 years before white women on average. African American men, 5 years before white men. Part of this has to do with access to quality health care. African Americans are twice as likely as whites to be uninsured, and when they do receive medical attention, studies have shown that they get inferior and unequal care. But even more than these factors, what the research increasingly finds is that dealing with racism and discrimination on a regular basis has incredibly damaging repercussions for black people's health. But maybe the most disturbing example of all of how race-based inequality persists in America is in our criminal justice system.
Today, there are more African Americans under correctional control, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began.
Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, argues persuasively that America's war on drugs has resulted in a devastating new system of racial control.
Many Americans just have no idea the scale of mass incarceration in the United States, because it's a phenomenon that does not affect everyone. It affects certain groups defined largely by race and class.
Breaking news out of Contra Costa County, a drug bust in Pacheco.
Charged in what officials say is the largest drug bust in Baltimore County.
Suspect's not home, but minutes later he unwittingly walks into the dragnet.
What's your name?
My name?
Yeah.
My name Antoine.
Got him.
The size of our prison system quintupled in a 30-year period of time, not due to rising crime rates, but rather because we declared a drug war, a war on drugs.
These people are wrecking our society.
If you're a casual drug user, you're an accomplice to murder.
All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs.
And launched a Get Tough movement that swept millions of poor people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, into our prisons and jails, primarily for non-violent and drug-related offenses, the very sorts of crimes that occur with roughly equal frequency in middle-class white communities and on college campuses and go largely ignored. You know, a white kid living in rural Kansas doesn't drive to the hood to get his marijuana or his meth or his ecstasy or a little bit of cocaine. He's buying it from someone most likely of his own race down the road. Drug dealing happens in all communities of all colors, but those who do time for drug crime in the United States are overwhelmingly black and brown. Once they're caught, they're swept into the criminal justice system, branded criminals and felons, and then ushered into a parallel social universe in which the basic civil and human rights that were supposedly won in the civil rights movement are stripped from them. Once branded a criminal or felon, they're denied the right to vote in many states, automatically excluded from juries, and legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits.
If you break the law, you no longer have a home in public housing.
So many of the old forms of discrimination that we supposedly left behind in the old Jim Crow era are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. That's why I say we haven't ended racial caste in America. We've just redesigned it.
It might be difficult to admit, but it's certainly not difficult to understand how this kind of racialized justice system ends up benefiting white people. We're not only much less likely to be harassed by the police when we're innocent, we're also more likely to get away with illegal activity when we're guilty. Congratulating ourselves on how post-racial and colorblind we are does nothing to change these facts, and in many ways makes things worse.
I think these examples of Black success help to blind us to the ways in which systems and structures operate in our society today to lock millions of people out.
Something really big and bold has happened.
You know, during the Jim Crow era, examples of Black success undermine the logic of the prevailing caste system. Today, you know, these Black success stories actually reinforce the logic of the prevailing caste system, the superficially colorblind logic that it's their fault they're at the bottom. And if they only tried harder, they could be President Obama. And that simply isn't the case.
Going for jobs and even applying to universities, you'll hear everyone talk about like the quota. They have to meet their quota of, you know, their diverse population in the workplace or in the student body. So if there's, you know, a lot of white females applying for a job and they have a similar resume to one African-American female, she may get that over the white female, whether she has as much experience or not. Just because they need.
Everywhere I give talks, whether it's the Deep South, Northeast, Midwest, or the West Coast, white folks ask me, well, what about us? Why don't you talk about racism against white people? The undercurrent in all of this is the sense that efforts to curb discrimination against people of color, while admirable in the past, have gotten out of control and are somehow now hurting whites. And you'll hear this kind of thing all the time. People complaining about what they call reverse discrimination.
This is a case of clear and obvious reverse discrimination.
Complaining about affirmative action.
What do you think that affirmative action is for?
Affirmative action is to increase diversity by discriminating against white males, and that's why I oppose it.
Or they say that since we have scholarships for Black students, we should have scholarships for white students only as well.
Dozens, hundreds, thousands of ethnically based scholarships that were for this group, that group, or whichever, but none of them were focusing on Caucasian Americans.
The implication is that if we're being fair, we should also talk about how white people are sometimes the victims of racism. In fact, when researchers from Tufts and Harvard universities recently asked white people if racism against whites was worse than racism against people of color, most of them said yes, that the gains of people of color were coming at a direct cost to whites.
I'm really not proud of this statement that I'm about to make, but if I look at an application and I see we're an equal opportunity employer, like that's great, A+ job. But in the back of my mind, I'm kind of like, crap, I hope they don't have like this kind of quota thing, like you guys were saying, where they need to fill up a certain amount of different races. I feel weird saying anything about this just because it's just like, oh, this is what it's like, so.
And while there's no question there's real anxiety and fear when it comes to programs like affirmative action, the fact is, for every person of color who benefits from affirmative action in college, there are 2 white students who received preferential treatment because of their parents' alumni status or other family connections.
If in fact the concern over so-called reverse discrimination had any relationship to reality, people of color would in fact be getting all the good stuff. Some people think they are. I hear it all the time. People of color are taking all the good jobs. Where the hell are these jobs? In Second Life?
Another study found that only about 1/4% of all the scholarship money in this country is specifically earmarked for students of color, which means 99.75% of all that scholarship money is money that whites can compete for, and the vast majority of those dollars will in fact go to white students. There's also the fact that the schools attended by mostly black and Latino students are more than 10 times as likely as majority white schools to be places of concentrated poverty.
By the time anyone steps on a college campus, there has already been 12 to 13 years of institutionalized affirmative action for white folks. That is to say, racially embedded inequality, which has benefited those of us who are white.
But even though that's true, there's clearly this feeling among a lot of white people that things used to be easier and that now those good old days are slipping away.
How did we get here? I don't even understand this America anymore.
And underneath all of that is a very clear, if unstated, racial subtext. Along with anxiety and fear about the economic crisis, there's also been a lot of unease about the fact that we have a black president and that the demographics of the country are shifting in ways that point to a future where whites will no longer be the clear majority. All of this helps explain why some of these folks are so adamant, so angry, so upset that they, and I'm using their words now, want to take their country back.
We want our country back! We want our country back!
Tea Party message to Washington that we're going to take our country back.
We're just plain American people who are mad. We want to take our country back.
I've got to run here, but just real quickly, I was at a town hall yesterday, and I really had to take some people to task. Very nice people, but they were using those buzzwords that I don't think people realize all the time, like real Americans, or give me back my America was one of the songs, or take back America. It's like, what do you mean by that?
Well, when you stand up and you wax nostalgic and say things like, I want the country that the founders envisioned, when the country the founders envisioned was a formal system of white supremacy, excuse me if I find it a little hard to think that race is not perhaps playing a pretty big role.
After one of the CNN appearances, I got an email from a woman who was a Tea Party supporter who was upset with my characterization of the Tea Party movement. She said that their calls to take the country back had nothing to do with race, that they were simply calling for a return to an era of low taxes and small government. When I replied to her, I asked her to give me a year that epitomized in her mind this era of American history. Which year did she and the rest of the Tea Party want to return to? Her response was almost immediate and not very surprising. The year she chose? 1957.
Leave it to Beaver.
It's a year that many conservative white Americans hold dear, and not just because it's the year Leave It to Beaver premiered on television.
Traditional America as we knew it is gone. Ward, June, Wally, and the Beav, out of here.
For many conservatives, that was the golden age of American history, a time when everything was in its place before all the struggles for equality and justice came along in the 60s and messed everything up.
Do you remember how that felt? Do you remember what life was like?
There's this sense that we've lost something precious, special, deeply American.
This is about the systematic dismantling of this country.
We are truly concerned about the heartbeat of our country.
They can have my country when they pry it from my cold, dead fingers.
That people are overtaxed, overburdened, forced to hand over their hard-earned money to government bureaucrats so they can reward people for not working.
I think the fact is Americans are overtaxed.
Government is spending too much, that we pay too high taxes.
I mean, everyone in America knows that Americans are overtaxed. Hello. We pay more taxes than we used to pay at every level.
The only problem with that argument, it's not even close to being true. The fact is, the top marginal tax rate in 2012 was 35%. A lot of people today think that rate is too high. But what was the rate in 1957? It was a whopping 91%, nearly 3 times higher than what it is today.
There's too much involvement in the government. We can take care of ourselves.
Our government is spending far too much, and our federal government is far too large, trying to do far too much.
As for the size of government, in the pre-civil rights golden age, it wasn't small by any stretch of the imagination. The programs created by the New Deal, which disproportionately and almost exclusively benefited white people, weren't just massive in scale, they were massively popular. So why do we have this idea that the pre-1960s was this bastion of American independence and freedom, of small government and low taxes? And why do so many people today want to go back to that mythologized past? According to Martin Gillens, it has everything to do with our perception of who we think is benefiting from government programs today, especially those programs we like to call welfare.
I'm Marty Gillens. I'm a political science professor at Princeton University, and much of my research is on public attitudes towards anti-poverty policy and racial policy. The major work that I've done in that area is a book called Why Americans Hate Welfare.
Welfare spending now topping $1 trillion a year.
The American public tends to view welfare recipients as undeserving, not really working hard to support themselves, and they view welfare recipients as disproportionately black. Both of those perceptions are at variance with what we know about the reality of welfare recipients.
Even though the clear majority of people who benefit from government assistance are white, there's this perception that welfare and other government programs are somehow a black phenomenon. Why is this? Well, Gillens says it's because that's who we see on TV.
Starting in 1965, media portrayals of the poor have been disproportionately African American.
Esther Williams, 21 years old, mother of a 19-month-old infant and a welfare client.
If you look at either print news or television news coverage of poverty, you see far too many black faces relative to the true proportions of African Americans among the poor in this country.
Alcinette Vargas, who has 6 children and a husband with a minimum wage job, reached her time limit in January without full-time work and was cut from welfare.
So when we see stories about the poor are represented by people of color at a rate that is far greater than statistical reality. But it wasn't always that way. Before the mid-60s, media coverage of the poor consisted mostly of whites. It was the unemployed during the Depression, the people who fled the Dust Bowl, the rural poor in places like Appalachia. And the coverage of these poor white folks was overwhelmingly sympathetic and humanizing. As a result, public support for social safety net programs was high from the period of the Great Depression all the way into the 1960s. But all of that changed.
There are too many people taking advantage of the system. Why don't we spend some time developing a system that weeds out the cheaters?
Once news coverage, media imagery, and political rhetoric started to equate poverty with people of color, we began to view the poor not as fellow Americans who were the hard luck victims of a system that had failed them, but instead as moochers who were abusing the system and undermining the nation's work ethic. And the sad irony is that there are millions of white people in this country who need those programs too. And now they're not there. Those programs have been cut to the bone because the beneficiaries have been seen as undesirable, undeserving others.
How long will we have to pay for slavery? Man, I'm talking about the people on welfare trying to suck out the economy of this country, get a free house, a free car, free gasoline. They want it all because they think they deserve it. Well, in this country, you got to get a job. So don't, and work.
Did you get a tax cut this year from Barack Obama?
I don't pay taxes.
You don't pay taxes.
I'm disabled from a truck accident and veterans benefits.
May I speak now?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I'm 90 years old, and I just wanted to ask the colored man, why don't colored people, instead of saying what we did to them, why don't they say what we did for them? They talk about the slavery, but since then they have given welfare, free medicine, free everything.
Ma'am, I think this is more of a conversation about the relationship between the administration and the people on Wall Street, and not necessarily one that's based on race.
Oh, okay. I'm not a racist. That was my comment. Thank you.
None of this is by accident. The racial subtext that runs through a lot of the anti-government rhetoric is the result of an explicit political strategy that's been put to use by conservative politicians for decades.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing.
In a recently uncovered recording, the late Republican strategist Lee Atwater, one of the pioneers of race-based political appeals, was heard talking quite openly about how the strategy works.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, And all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
The idea was for Republican politicians to speak in a kind of racial code designed to turn white working-class voters against government programs, the very programs that they themselves had benefited from for years.
The present welfare system has become a monstrous, consuming outrage.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
And this kind of thing runs right up to the present day.
President Obama is the most effective food stamp president in American history.
This is precisely the point historian John Bracey, a veteran of the civil rights movement, has been trying to make for years.
What the ruling class in this country has successfully done is to label social programs as black programs, minority programs, and then you can kill it.
I don't want to make people's lives better by giving them somebody else's money. I want to give them the opportunity to go out and earn the money.
You know, that's the most foundational thing in American life. I mean, that's Obamacare.
Everything that is getting pushed through Congress, including this health care bill, are transforming America. And they are all driven by President Obama's thinking on one idea: reparations.
Virtually every normal kind of social program that would have kicked in Europe in the 19th century, you know, in order to help working people, you know, survive under capitalism, we don't have.
While the state's budget deficit has reached almost $500 million now, the state's Medicaid program has announced more than $14 million is being cut to various providers throughout the state.
There are people that want to expand Medicare. Like I just got back from Mississippi. They're debating expanding Medicare in Mississippi. They need every nickel and dime they can get in there from anybody. They should not question anybody. If Martians came and said, we're going to give you something, they should say, whatever it is, we'll take it, because they need everything. They refuse. They have a political system that's still dysfunctional enough that they turn down aid for white people in Mississippi because black people get some too.
This is how racism victimizes white people indirectly as well. American history is full of examples of white anxiety and resentment around race being used to undermine their own interest and their own